So it is my pleasure to introduce Yana Valachovic, our speaker tonight. Yana is passionate about communities, helping communities learn to live with wildfire. She is a registered professional forester and scientist, and is recognized as a leader in developing and delivering local and state strategies to improve wildfire resilience. Yana is also our official forest advisor and the county director for the University of California Cooperative Extension Service for Humboldt and Del Norte counties. She is a founding steering committee member of the Northern California Prescribed Fire Council. Yana and her team have conducted post-fire assessments throughout California, and she has co-authored papers on fire behavior in coastal California forests. She is also currently the co-lead of the Northern California region of the California Fire Science Consortium. As you can tell, Yana is a very busy person, and I think we're fortunate to have her with us tonight. So please join me in welcoming Yana Valachovic.
Well, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be with you all tonight. I'm going to start with plants. I just spent last week in Death Valley and got to go see some of the desert blooming and the beaver tail cactuses with their beautiful, luscious, bright pink flowers and so many cool things. It's really fun to get to see a bit of the super bloom and enjoy some of what California's bounty looks like this year. I'll also share I had a high school student who was successful in science fair, went on to UC Santa Cruz and is currently a plant science major. So we're doing pretty good in the family, she's the daughter of two foresters and has decided that botany maybe is a safe place to hang out. So I think that's probably true. You're close enough, but not too close. So, well, I'm looking forward to talking with you all tonight about wildfire. I know it's something that we get a lot of media attention about, and there's a lot of, different threads in that space. And so what I hope to do is talk at a bunch of different scales and around what we can do as individuals, try and offer some hope in this space, because there's, I think, a lot of just feeling overwhelmed by the complexity of the issues and how is it possible to live in California anymore? I mean, like, where is it safe? As one narrative. So want to be a tad bit controversial and maybe be a little bit punchy for some of you, because I think it's good to hear different perspectives and see if we can try those on and see if we like them or not. So my apologies in advance if I say something that maybe doesn't fit with your narrative, but it's okay to have someone say something that maybe makes a challenge. So you can maybe check me later and decide if I really. So I want to talk about living with wildfire, both at the landscape and at the personal scale, and really offer some sense of vision for resilience. I think you all have probably spent some time looking at the satellite imagery, over the last several years, where you can see the smoke columns, and they come in very different and interesting ways. Like sometimes the fire is nowhere near us, but smoke gets pushed up and then pushed back down. And this idea of watersheds, and how we're all connected by water. But I think wildfire has really reminded me about how much we're connected by air, airsheds, and this upstream, downstream, up mountain, down slope connection is really I think redefining how we think about the health of our ecosystems, the health of our communities, and how we're all in this together. I mean, it's uniting urban and rural in a way where we need to have a more nuanced conversation about quality of life and effective and resilient environments to live in. So I want to start with an opening question. When it comes to wildfire, what are you all individually doing here?
Nothing.
Love it. Okay, that's not as we live on the coast, right? And so maybe it doesn't.
I want my yard to be lush and stay lush. I don't know, gray water.
So you're watering a lot.
So I'm just hoping that my plants.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. Anyone else?
When we had to put on a new roof, we put on the most fire resistant.
What was that? Okay,
Yeah, it was the best quality, what do they call it, the,
class A,
sorry,
class A.
yeah.
Okay, great. That's a very important investment. Saw a hand over here. What else are you all doing? Okay, so you've been thinking about your roofs. Anyone else?
Well, they make it clear the plants around your house, so I've been pruning around my house.
Okay,
Plants that I love, that I wouldn't want.
okay. Anyone sign up for the alerts? Okay, that's good. Do you know that you can sign up for multiple locations? Right, so like I grew up in southern Humboldt County, I still have a cabin, and so I sign up there, I sign up for my mom. And I sign up for me and my place in town, so I can get alerts at all three. The August fire came close to us. So, you know, it's a good reminder that it's important and it's possible to have multiple locations. What about you, Beth?
I moved to Wildfire.
Excellent, right? You moved a pile of wood to to remove some of the fuels. Excellent.
Can you tell us what the alert is? Whose alert that you?
So the alert system is interesting. The alert system is triggered in Humboldt County by the Office of Emergency Services, and it will be an alert related to either a preparation for an evacuation or an immediate evacuation. And it will give you some sense of that time, and it will not tell you which direction the fire is coming from. It will not tell you where the fire is coming from. It will just say that you are under some kind of consideration in that space. It is triggered through a complicated set of metrics. And there's a new app called Zone Haven that Humboldt County has just invested in, where you could actually then go in, if you still have internet access, into Zone Haven, and you'll find out a lot more information about like where your block is and how that's rotated. So if you're in Willow Creek, you know, what would be the evacuation route and other details associated with that.
Does it overlap with the tsunami alert system?
Does it overlap with the tsunami alert system? It's yes, it's through the alert system, and it's triggered by geographic areas. So like when the August fire did that huge run where it moved 20 miles in an evening, coming north, you know, we didn't need to alert the whole county, we needed to alert certain areas. So specific to that.
So you find out what zone you're in, like you have some kind of zone code, and then.
Yep, so you can type in your address to figure out where you are. So I think about this though, because a lot of us live on the coast here and we feel a bit protected here, but then we recreate somewhere else or we visit family somewhere else. And so one of the things to think about is there's no uniform alert system in California. So every community you're in some of them will be triggered by your phone, and you can just, like I've been in Mendocino County and I've gotten an alert at 3 a.m. when I'm staying in Ukiah for Brook Hills and Willits, and be like, why am I doing this? I'm in Ukiah. Well, my phone is roaming in the Mendocino space, and so I get them. Not every county has that same system. So what I want you to think about though is situational awareness, and you know, that little spidey sense when something doesn't feel right. That's a really good indication that you should be thinking more differently than we have in the past, perhaps. And so we can talk more about that. What about your neighbors? Like understanding who's vulnerable in your community? Have you thought about that? Great.
So I purchased a house recently. You know, there's so many variables to fill in that, but the whole urban versus rural, you know, carbon footprint, distance commuting to work, building communities are the kind of things we think a lot about, but wildfire risk, I think I thought a little bit more about this time than I did in the past. Certainly there's regions that are safer.
So what you're saying is you thought more about wildfire risk. Did you get an 8038 defensible space clearance and home hardening assessment? So what's new actually, and this is kind of cool. I was involved in this piece of legislation, and so now if I don't know how long it's been in the city of you, or if you have ever purchased a home, but there's disclosures that will say, oh, you're in this certain kind of area, you might experience, you're in an ag zone, or you're in this kind of zone. There is now a new requirement that when you sell your property, you have to disclose the type of defensible space work and then mitigations that have been done to the exterior of the home to resist wildfire. As part of the educational process to the next consumer of that property. It doesn't mandate that certain actions are done. It just says, here what has happened. That, however, is creating an interesting conversation about what the standards should be. And so it's starting to become a negotiating point in the sales agreement.
So this might, I don't think I had that. I mean, maybe it was there, I just.
The one you said, oh, should have been.
Oh. Like, yeah, you gotta get rid of that.
So good stuff. I mean, so I spent a lot of time thinking about the process of change and where we have those points of intersection and what we can do to make a difference in this space. So we'll kind of keep that thread going. Okay. Now I'm here. Let's do that. So I'm just gonna set the stage a little bit and talk about some of the big things that are going on. Did you know in the last 10 years, 1 out of every 8 acres in California has burned? Right? I think it's just a stat, right? You know, how we interpret that, there's been a lot of good fire and a lot of bad fire in that space too, right? Just because it's burned doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. But I think it's a staggering statistic though, because at some level we sort of think that it's happening somewhere else and aggregate it all out together. It's much more significant than I think I put the credit towards. In part because we're sheltered underneath the redwood curtain and the fog belt, and we maybe don't feel it in the same way. But the rest of California is really feeling it now. So do you know that we've lost 43,000 structures in that time period? Think about the carbon emissions of that and the contamination and all of that in our lungs. I mean, that is really, really significant. You know, and we've lost 170 something people in this process. These are, you know, really big. We're in this, it's a really big moment. We're at a point of pivot around fire that we haven't experienced before. So we're transforming landscapes in very significant ways, and we are transitioning areas from forest to shrub in a really rapid transition. I know the gentleman back there asked me about kind of the revegetation and, you know, what are we doing to restore these landscapes? Well, think about the seed sorts element, the scaling up of being able to have planting stock. For all of that reforestation needs. I mean, we basically pretty much shut down our reforestation sectors over the last couple of decades. I know it was like, I've been in my job 23 years, and it was the question I used to feel the most, like, how do I get planting stock? And we used to have like 7 nurseries in Humboldt and Delaware counties that you could go buy trees from, and now we have 1 or 2. So the ramping up to respond to this moment and the transition that's happening in our landscapes is really significant. I mentioned a little bit about smoke, but the public health impacts associated with the smoke that we're experiencing are staggering. And you know, the number of smoke days are increasing. San Jose has had a 400% increase in smoke days. Los Angeles, a 230% increase in smoke days. This is really pivotal. And there are lots of associated health impacts that come from that. You know, just some illustration of how smoke moves and the connection point that we have between other communities. Let's see if I can make. No, I can make it go, but okay. It's something to really think about. I just wanted to forecast a couple of things, like think about the educational impact that's happening associated with this. Between 2002 and 2018, the greatest cause for school closures was wildfires. And, you know, then we hit COVID on top of that, and our rural communities are just really suffering from this issue in particular. You know, I think we'll be able to have quantitative metrics about the impacts that has happened to this next generation in a very real way. And then there's the economic impacts. In 2018, there was a study that looked at trying to analyze it and just, they put $150 billion in losses associated with 2018. That's the year of the campfire, 28 billion in capital losses, 32 billion in healthcare costs, 89 billion in like all the indirect downstream effects. And then, you know, I talked to lots of different groups, and maybe this isn't a thing that grabs you, but think about other elements of what it takes to clean up these events. So our landfill service life is being shortened because of all the debris. There's a much more accelerated component of road wear and tear from all of the, you know, additional vehicles it takes in this post-fire environment. I think we all can relate to the fact that insurance and the insurance market is changing. And I mean, the way to undermine the economy is to take the insurance capacity out of the system. You cannot buy or sell a piece of property. You cannot realize your asset if you cannot create an opportunity to have insurance be a part of that equation. So we're tied, you know, emotionally, physically, and economically to the health of all of California's ecosystems in a way that we might not recognize. And we're just not at a place where we can continue to have this pace and scale of fire in a way that we can manage. So what I'm going to talk about today is kind of how do we get ourselves out of this crisis, and you know, what does the restoration of fire look like, and then can bring it in on a more personal level about how you can help you and your family. So I'm going to talk about sort of the bigger ecosystem framing and then bring it back down to the home scale. So it's kind of a mix and weave between two of those different worlds, and I think that maybe reflects who I am. I'm a natural resource and, you know, professional, and then I also think a lot about communities and what we can do. And that is way too small for this screen here. What I want to say is when you think about resiliency, right? So what does resiliency mean? Like there are people probably have an off the cap definition of resiliency. Sure. So resilient, okay, and back.
I think it means be able to stand a great amount, let's say, change without becoming something else.
Bounce back.
Or at least it comes back.
So the ability to withstand and endure some kind of stressor and then come back to the pre-disturbance state is really the concept around resiliency. And you know, there's a lot of different dials to turn in this space, and I think we probably have, if we were to brainstorm about what we think the solutions are, you know, there are many solutions and many different facets that need to be turned. I think about these as, and I'll go into some detail, but these are all dials that we have to turn, every one of them. And the challenge is that we really thought about fire in this very siloed way where it's someone else's problem, it's someone else's issue to work on. But in reality, we really have to figure out how to bring this together. So we talk about wildland management. I think, you know, after the Tubbs fire and the fires in Santa Rosa, it was like, oh, well, what can we do to the forest? How do we manage the forest? You know, how do we bring in prescribed fire? How do we manage fuels? Is there a way to accelerate that? Is there a way to bring in a private sector solution in the wood products market to be able to, you know, consume some of that fuel? I mean, that all makes sense, I think, in our normal natural resources framing. But what is the role of open space and agriculture? You know, they can provide those locations where you see open space and agriculture can provide great buffers, buffer zones and staging zones and temporary refuge areas. You know, and thinking about the heterogeneity of our landscapes, where you've got this intermix of urban and undeveloped landscape and how that commingles together so that you can network those pieces. But how do you deal with infrastructure protection? Whether it be utilities, water, hospitals, like where do we put our investments on those really critical resources that we need to function in our systems, right? There's more to it, you know, there's really special areas, both environmentally, but there's also really special community value areas that, you know, what's the role of land use planning and building codes and zoning, and how do those intersect? And do we have the political will to talk through these things? Don't. what can we do to our built environment is the term I'm gonna use, like the fire resilient homes and construction space. How do we design a building of the future? How do we retrofit a building of the future so that we don't have 43,000 structures lost in the next decade? And I think we've spent a lot of time sort of understanding, getting better tools and resources to forecast what might be coming and to, create an alert system so that we're more aware. And then we've, done a really good job over the years in fire response, mutual aid concept that you can bring federal and state resources together, that you can have the volunteer fire department and city municipal fire departments all work together. We've got this really well-honed system where we can have an ebb and flow depending on what we need. But all of that has to work to be able to create resiliency, right? And when we in fact do have some kind of damaging incident, what do we do to learn to build smarter? And how do we rebuild communities that are more robust over time? So I'm going to use this as kind of a framing of how I think about the issues and the idea that we got to turn a lot of these dials to be thinking about a fire adaptive future. That being said, I'm totally optimistic about it. And I think the part of the challenge is really having a sense of vision about where you want to go to. And then if we can share that vision together, then we can all start rolling in the same direction. What I mostly hear is people say, oh, it's terrible, it's messy. Should I be a refugee? Should I move somewhere else? Is Oregon a safer place? Is there some other way to live in the state? And I'm not afraid to live in the state at all. I'm not afraid to live in some of those fire-prone places. I just want to do it differently than the way we've done it in the past. So let's bring some vocabulary here together. So fire is we get these cute little triangles, is the product of fuel, oxygen, and heat. And fire behavior, again, is reflected on the available fuel you have, the topography or landscape. You imagine that fire burns uphill and preheats as it goes uphill, and it's heavily influenced by the weather. So in both of these equations, the part that we have some control over is this fuel element. And so I think what we're going to talk about today is, how do we manage that fuel element? What constitutes fuel? And, what can we expect? So where can we expect wildfire in California?
Just about everywhere. I live two miles from the coast in San Diego and Encinitas, and I evacuated twice in 4 years in the early 2000s. And fire came within a half a mile of our house, and I was coastal. So it burned 500,000 acres in those two fires of San Diego. It went 60 miles in like one day.
Right.
Burned from, it was, I evacuated twice because of the alert system. But, living on the coast, and now I live next to a redwood forest. Right. With redwoods in my backyard. But, I'm still not, I still don't think I'm safe from fire, even with a redwood forest next. Because that they can, if it's dry, they can burn too. Oh, yeah.
So the issue with living on the coast here is it depends on the sequence of events. So when we're in capacity or condition to burn, is the rest of the state conditioned to burn? We're dry enough to burn, is the rest of the state dry enough to burn? Heck yeah, right? The question is what event happens in what order? So in 2017, when the Tubbs fire happened, the one in Santa Rosa that burned across the freeway, do you know that we had an ignition that day? And do you know that ignition was in Blue Lake?
Yeah, and we were lucky that those planes were here fueling up so that I saw that fire.
So what time of day was that ignition?
It was like 4:35.
So what time was the ignition in Santa Rosa?
Like about the same exact time.
At night.
Oh, it was 9:30.
9:30 at night, the wind event hit here first, it hit there second. So think about the reverse order. Had it hit there at 4:30
lucky.
and us at 9:30, what resources would have been left here? The mutual aid system does mandate that you need people and personnel in location. But the point I want to make is that for us, our biggest issue is if you have a lightning series with multiple ignitions in multiple locations, or you have a wind event where you have multiple issues and multiple ignitions, our order really matters. So most of the time we're fine, but there are situations where they cannot deploy resources fast enough here because resources are spread over locations. So I'm going to then drill into the wildland management side of this equation and think about sort of the restoration of fire and kind of what the desired future conditions are, and talk a little bit more from the forest land situation. Anyone been on a prescribed burn? Look at you. What were your experiences? What did you think? All good?
Oh, yeah.
Anyone scared of it? Curious?
I'm sure. I never had a fall. It was.
Did you bring him on board? Yeah. Right, so I think we're getting more conversant with the idea of using prescribed fire as a tool for fuel reduction, as well as a tool for ecosystem benefit, as well as for cultural uses. And we've lost that tool for a couple of decades, and that has had some impact. So the question I want to ask is, when and where is it appropriate? Is it a first entry? Is it an always tool? How do you all think about that? Is it an encroaching conifer tool? Yes. Yes, it is. Sorry, that's where some of my research space is. Right? I mean, when and where? When can you put prescribed fire in, and when do you have to start with something else? Right? So like in these two examples, maybe for managing some of that meadow encroachment, you can start with prescribed fire as a first entry, but this situation on the right hand side, there's a lot of fuel buildup, and if you start in that situation, you're likely to have more intense fire than you want to have. So to me, what's interesting is just thinking about what's in our toolbox and how do we manage these ecosystems, and how do we get ourselves kind of out of that regularity of fire, and how long is it going to take us to get back into that sort of maintenance condition space. So a lot of the work I do, especially in forested conditions, is thinking about first entry with something else, some kind of mechanical treatment to be able to manage some of the fuel bed heights, for example, so that over time we can create better conditions. And I think we're getting some pretty good data to share that the combination of layering of treatments really makes a difference. Here's the bootleg fire in 2021, and this aerial image to me tells me a lot. So this area, I don't exactly know where the boundaries are, but the thinning alone prescription, and the prescription, I don't have the full details, but it was a moderate thinning prescription. It's something that I think we would all generally feel pretty good about. You can see that there were a lot of things that it wasn't an aggressive thinning. But when you paired thinning with prescribed fire to manage some of the post fuel conditions, the result when wildfire burned through was substantially better than thinning alone. So as compared to the no treatment where the forest had been left to develop on its own. So there are more and more examples of kind of these layered and nested treatments that are really beginning to show some impact. We saw a couple of those around Tahoe in the last couple of years and other locations. So I think we've got some options for success and some examples where we can put some good tools to work.
Where would that bootleg fire?
That bootleg fire is in southern Oregon to the east of Ashland, over in that direction. So drier forest conditions in general, but
Looks like those trees are all dead though in the thinning only.
correct. So basically these, if I didn't explain this well enough, these are no treatment, thinning and prescribed fire, and then stands that have been thinned alone, and then a wildfire burns through. And here's how it behaved. And so what we saw, they were all green before the wildfire burned through, except you just had very different behaviors.
But are those trees that were thinned, are they all dead?
I think many of them are dead.
Because then it's almost better to burn it all, because then there's
Well,
a
no,
bunch of
you know,
dead.
these here,
Not those, but
No,
the no treatment, it just seems like they're thinning and. The. I just did this little trip around Oregon and. The Trinity Alps last week, and I could see all the fires that had happened in the last 5 years, and there's just a bunch of dead trees standing that look like they're just more fuel. I mean, isn't that the area that's thinned, isn't that worse, more fuel than?
okay, so couple different things going on here. So what I'm just trying to illustrate is, here's what one example where you can see different treatments laid out. Now, the next question, and your question is, what happens over time, and what do you do with these stands that have been impacted by fire? And that's a whole secondary question, more than I'm sort of putting up here, but. You know, how we then choose to manage the post-fire condition, when you've got a lot of damage, is controversial in some ways, and yet it you can clearly see that left alone, there's a lot of standing fuel, and what happens is that the fuel contribution, and initially all the trees are standing, then the needles and branches start to come down, then the bowls start to fall over, and then you get a really heavy fuel load. What we are seeing throughout California is that we are getting reburns on top of those stands, and then you really got succession restarted all the way back to the shrub phase. Oh, wait, what did you just say? So you're then moving a forest, so like
To a shrub phase,
to a shrub phase,
because they still stand, but
because your next, if you have a fire on top of a fire.
Yeah.
And if it burns super hot,
because all that would say that's gonna be the future fire. It's not like it has a.
no, it's more that you've got a lot of fuel to be able to have a long residence time fire. So a fire that's gonna burn for a long time with a lot of heat output. Then it becomes much.
But I think that the trees was like the birds would come in, the woodpeckers and the beetles and all that stuff.
Sure,
That's something else that happened inside.
well, it depends on whether it depends on the time frame. You get probably about 10 years of mitigated fuels, and then you get a huge pulse. Right, and so then if you get ignition in that next 10-year horizon, then you can have a much more damaging effect.
I just walked through some forests that burned 5 years ago, and it looked like that, dead trees standing. And it doesn't look like anything's grown. It really doesn't look. Like, I don't even see shrubs. I think it was a really.
Well, it depends on what, okay, so this was more than I was talking about today, but I think it really depends as a manager around what you want that stand to look like, and what resources you have, and what tools are in the toolbox. Right, I would argue, and so maybe you won't all like this, but as a professional forester, if you can come in and remove some of those trees in the first 12 months, you can get some economic return before those trees degrade, and then you will have resources and dollars to be able to invest back in reforestation and the other mitigations that you need. If you wait 3 to 4 years, then there's no value in that.
And you're leaving trees for.
In the post-fire condition like this, there is so little there's a ton that's non-merchantable that you would leave for the wildlife and for all those other values. You're in a crisis management situation, and yeah, okay. All right, I'm a little bit off topic, but let's see if I can get there. So here's how I think about the wildland space. So part of our challenge is that we really have to get to the place where we can make some long-term sustained investments. And that's an investment in scale that we have not done before. And part of that, in my mind, is really thinking about essential infrastructure and what it takes to actually be able to manage these landscapes. And when we lose infrastructure, it really limits our toolbox. So like in the Southern Sierra, as an example, anybody remember the drought and the 100 million dead trees that died? So what did we do when we had 100 million dead trees die? Almost nothing, because we had no trucking capacity, we had no milling and manufacturing capacity, we had no disposal capacity. So the most benign treatment that was done when it was near roads, power lines, and homes was the disposal and air curtain burners. Burn trees, because that was our only option in a controlled fuel box with no collection of energy or other resources. So the idea of having infrastructure that's capable to do restoration, that's capable to do value-added manufacturing, all of that flows and meshes together. And having a role, the private sector to be able to support some of that work is really critical. I think the other piece when it comes to forests, and I hinted at this earlier, is that this viewpoint that we're kind of all in this together and that we're united by air and health and economics. I think is an important reflection because your neighbor's condition, your upstream condition affects your health just as much as you may affect them. So, we're working a lot on trying to think about how do we supercharge a workforce to work in this space. Like there is such a dearth of people in every sector in this equation right now. And so the young lady is still in the back. I mean, we just need workers at every scale. So whether it's junior college, the trades, trucking, permitting, innovation, we just don't have enough people. There are careers at the ready for everybody. And here's kind of where I want to say where I think we also need some innovation and some gratis here, and that is that and you may not all agree with this, but state and federal laws, especially through the California Environmental Quality Act and the National Environmental Policy Act, have become somewhat of a barrier in the space in that when you propose a project, the no action alternative is what you compare it to. And the no action alternative assumes that there'll be no wildfire in that future area. And I think what we're learning is that that's not true. And so we're comparing doing something against this idea that nothing is going to happen. But succession will continue to happen and landscapes are going to continue to evolve. And what we're seeing is like in the Forest Service, they have a number of research natural areas, which are reserves that are meant to be studied, but are not meant to be manipulated. And almost all of them have burned in California. So what are we comparing our actions to? So I think we're ripe for some rethinking in that space. And within that, I think we're also ripe for thinking about what are metrics of success? What does success look like? And how do we actually, capture that? And what does health mean in our communities? What does health mean in our watersheds? I'm curious about, what is the workforce growing? What are the metrics in our schools? Are our schools improving? Are they declining in population? I graduated from Southport High School. And there were 90 students in my graduating class, and there were 5 National Merit Scholars in class in Southport High School, right? You can't imagine that today. If you look at the population of Southport, graduating class is 30 these days, right? What does success mean? Success in my mind means a vibrant youth population that feels like they may have some chance to come back and give back to their communities, right? So thinking in different ways is what I want to propose in this kind of facet of resiliency, and how we track that progress. I think we need to think a little different. So here's my last controversial piece. Part of the equation in my mind, and you might not all agree with this, is what do we do with the low value wood products that are out there? What do we do with material that can't go anywhere else? What do we do with the crumbs in the toaster? And bioenergy has been a really effective tool to do that, because you can get a value added product and you can get waste disposal simultaneously. So we do have a couple of cogeneration plants in Humboldt County. I'm really fortunate to be able to have those. But my vision for a future resilient California has a lot more of them, because we have to figure out how to dispose of this material. And an air curtain burner, burning it in the woods entirely, putting it in a landfill, like that's not a viable solution. And there's quite a bit of innovation going on right now about thinking about different ways to utilize these products, biofuels, jet engine fuel. A number of technology spaces are being developed, but we're not there yet. So we have to do something with that material. Yeah, 10 minutes. Okay. So how do you help your family? So I want to talk a little bit about the home and build space. This is an image from Paradise, and I don't know if it's big enough for you to all see, but the idea is that there are homes that have burned, that's what the gray parts are. Tell me what you see in that landscape,
Lots of trees.
lots of trees.
On the hill, the trees in it, it's like reverse. What you would expect.
Right, so you've got green belts that didn't burn, right? And you have, where do you see the most damage? It's around where the homes were themselves. So the homes are really becoming the greatest fuel contribution in many of these fires. So what I want to share with you, that home loss is quite predictable, but there are actions that are within our control that we can take that make a significant difference. And if I'm going to give you some highlights from some of this work, but what I want to talk about is I've been fortunate to be involved in a couple of post-fire investigations. This is Boulder, Colorado. You might remember the wildfire that happened on New Year's Eve in 2021. And I went as a part of a team to try and figure out, well, okay, here these homes were burned, but these homes were not. Was there something different about these homes and how they were constructed respective to these? It's about the sixth one of these I've done. And the answer was no, there was nothing different about those homes. The answer really was that there were people that responded, whether they were trained professionals or whether they were community members. Because the fire spread in through the most predictable way. So in Boulder, Colorado, in this location where you're on the Great Plains, you're on the backside of the Rocky Mountains, how do you create privacy?
A tree,
Plant a tree. See many trees?
fences.
That's right. We use fences to create our, our little curtilage zones where our kids and pets can play, and where we can feel like we've got some privacy from our neighbors, but our fences often become this interconnected network spaghetti that links us between one house to the next. So this was a grassland fire, not a forest fire. But the grassland fire has embers, so bits of debris that are capable of being moved in the air column. They landed at the base of these fences where there was dry debris that was collected and created ignition, or there was direct flame contact to the fences themselves, and then the fences ignited and they carried the fire directly to the houses. Is that something you could fix?
I was just in Boulder I've been around lately, but, my friend who lives there, we drove through there and they just are starting to rebuild it, but I noticed that there aren't fences. They're actually, I think, rebuilding without using fences as much.
Well, cool. So the point is, I'm not against fences. I think fences work great. Where I'm concerned is really in the attachment point of the fence to that house and changing that attachment point out to something that's not combustible. So here's an illustration of what embers look like. This is modern construction, this picture from the LA Times. Anything interesting in that photo to you? Anything striking to you about this photo? Where are the hot spots?
Near the house.
And the plants, right? Why along there? They're what? They're burnable. So the embers fly or move through the air column. They often hit the walls and then they drop down to the base. So this connection point, this place between the landscaping and the wall, really important. So if you've got combustibles there, it's a great place for ignition. Look at the eddies. See how these are going this direction and how these are swirling this direction.
Up against.
They do. They also get lodged in your vent system. So here's the under-eave vents that might be where the roof overhang comes. And so you can see how they can move through the air and you can imagine how they would penetrate those vents. So is this a wise use of that fire personnel's time? Could something have been done differently? I mean, just think, if you didn't have as much combustible material adjacent to that building, it'd be a non-issue. Okay. So I just want to share with you, there's a lab in North Carolina or South Carolina called at the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. This is a facility where you can construct buildings and there's an ember generator. Those were embers being generated. And then there's different air circulation routes that are being, like you can have gusts of wind, you can have sustained wind, you can guide it to all the different wind velocities. And so you can see, look at the collection point at the base of the wall. You can see the spread that comes out around the corner. We're using this lab to be able to understand and better look at different building products, building assembly ways. What I show you is a video. I want to talk about this before I show it to you. So this is a comparison of, it's of two different building styles. So same roof type. This is a cement board product with a rock mulch. Notice that there's vegetation planted a little bit farther away. This is a wood deck compared to a wood mulch with plants a little closer, and then a combustible siding and like a redwood or cedar siding. There are embers being blasted at both sides of the building. What I would like to see, and we don't have, is the middle piece, which would have been this siding, but with this mulch, with the rock mulch, because it would have provided a little middle alternative. This video is going to take 1 minute. And so what I want you to think about is how quickly it took for ignition until it got into the building. So 4 seconds, 5 seconds, we've already got ignition underneath the deck and it's wrapping around. You see the curvature coming around the corner and it's ignited these planted decorative plants. You can start to see it underneath the deck at 20 seconds. Look at 21 seconds, it's already up the edge of the roof wall and it's getting and pushing into the gable end vent there. We've got full ignition at 30 seconds underneath the deck.
So the eaves are covered with like metal on the house to the right, or the
No.
embers is.
So this is open eaves versus softened eaves on. So 45 seconds, you basically have now underneath penetration and into the attic.
Nothing's happening next door.
Nothing is happening because there's nothing combustible next door. But that being said, depends on the vent systems and how the vents are designed, because the vents could still allow penetration. So there's some new vents that I want to show you. So what you don't see, and I would argue, is that if there had been the middle example here, where you would have had and but yet rock mulch, I think you would have had the same outcome as the one on the right. So this is being used as some of the justification for changes in the defensible space code in California and new standards. And so what we are doing is talking about sort of three ways and pathways for fire. So there's something called direct flame contact, where you've got fire coming from the outside. It's got a pathway to be carried from the wildland directly to the house. And you can mitigate that by defensible space work and other activities. We've talked about embers just briefly there, but the idea is that embers can move in long distance and they can land adjacent to or into the vents or on the building through the gutters or on the deck and create ignition points. There's this third point called radiant heat, where you get ignition of something adjacent to a building or adjacent to another item, and the heat transfer through the air is sufficient to create ignition. So I'm illustrating that with a shed. It also could be vegetation, it could be a neighbor's house, a detached garage,
A window with curtains. And catch fire.
well, more so that you're going to see window pane breakage, and then you'll see failure, and then you've got basically an open conduit, same as you do with a cat door or dog door or a left window or a skylight or something to that effect. Then you've got easy access. So what we're trying to do is get people to understand that you have to manage and mitigate all three pathways to create a more robust exterior quality. I was involved with a paper looking at the effect of building codes in Paradise for the campfire. And I just want to show you some of the spatial dimensions of wildfire. So these are a couple of residential areas, and you can see that there's patterns. There's patterns here, like this neighborhood stays together, this one does not. What is it about, this kind of like an epidemiological contagion element that comes about? And what we learned is that 73% of homes were within 54 feet of a destroyed structure. The strongest predictor of survival or failure was basically your neighbor's condition. That's not to be defeatist. It's more to say we're in this together. We have to work together. And so if you have buildings that are close to each other, there is an interaction effect that happens between two buildings that can make a difference. I'm not gonna tell you that 54 feet is the magical number, it's just what we saw in our data set. And it does correspond to some other past post-fire investigations, so it's a working number. What we talk a lot about is 30 feet of separation is when actions need to change. So what you'll see happening in California, and I appreciate that you were doing some defensible space work, is there's a creation of a new defensible space zone. Which is called Zone 0, which is around the structure for the first 5 feet, around attachments like decks or stairs or things like that. And that slips in the way of what was the 0 to 30 zone. So there's this new zone in the middle. And that is designed basically to manage that indoor exposure. It's not being mandated yet, but it will start to get rolled out across California. So as plant lovers, it's not anti-plant, it's about placement and about thinking about where that placement is.
So you have sort of around the house.
5 feet out.
So you have a walkway around your house, you have a sitting area, you have an area to be closer to looking at your siding, and easier to maintain your house. It is much easier, yeah. Yeah. New changes, so then there's always a question about plants and plant lists, right? Anybody heard about a fire plant list? Oh, no, one, okay, they're all a bunch of malarkey. I just want to be clear about that. Any plant will burn under the right conditions. Right, and so, you know, it's really about cultural care and management. You can irrigate your plants and they will change their foliar moisture content significantly, and they are much more resilient and robust to wildfire. I mean, I think the 2 manzanita versus the palm examples, you know, both of those maintenance makes a difference, right? If you and I buy lavender, Carol, maintain your lavender beautifully, and I'm terrible with mine, and they both started the same condition, and then in a year mine's woody and nasty and yours is beautiful flush, right? It's not the plant's fault, it's my fault for maintained it. So be cautious about plant lists, but if you really want to get into it, giving you references, because there's lots of.
But how does like a hedgerow compared to a fence?
They're both problematic. They're both fuel. As is your firewood, as is your stored cool art, you know, as is the newspaper pile, as is your wood planter, it's all fuel. Yeah. Okay, so I'm following you. There are a number of places, and I've brought some brochures to talk about where there are particular vulnerable inner locations. So we talked about the fence to house concept, that's from Coffee Park. Rain gutters are lovely. Why do we have rain gutters? Also, you know, really it's about keeping the lower part of the siding dry, and so you don't have rot damage in the siding, as well as keeping your head dry when you walk underneath them. But they're terrific collection points, and so the roof edge at that point, that detail really matters. Anyone have a dormer on their house? So the roof to wall intersection is something to pay attention to, because you're asking the wall here to perform as well as the Class A roof that you just put on, but it's probably made, your siding is probably combustible. And so these locations where you get, you know, a 45-degree interaction, you can get leaf material pot there, and so it's easy to ignite that, and then you're asking the siding to be robust, and it can't. So more flashing, there are details that can improve that. These bottom 2 images are taken from inside that house that we burned, or was burned, and these are embers that are getting through the vents. These are the under eave vents, and these are the gable end vents. Anybody store anything in their attic? Right? And so there are things that can be done about that. So what I will pass out at some point is a brochure that sort of talks through these particular locations and how to digest it and how to make sense of it. They all matter, and they matter in different ways. If I were to leave you with any ideas, it's your roof, it's your vents, and it's the vegetation adjacent to the house. So most of us have vent screens that are this size, they're 1/4-inch mesh screen size. Great for airflow. My house on the bottoms totally needs that wide screen because it's soppy wet underneath there. But it will allow embers to penetrate. So your location I'm gonna stick with that in my house here because I have a mold issue, but the idea is that we're asking people to upgrade to these smaller mesh sizes. The problem with the smaller mesh size is that you can use a spray gun and paint them and then basically seal them off if you're not careful, so it takes a little more care, but it can make a difference. There are also a whole new class of different kinds of vents that are designed to resist flames and embers, and they have different technologies in them. And some of them have an incandescent paint in them, which when heated seals up and will shut the vent down. This one is like a tortured path, so it's hard for an ember to get through that kind of environment. This one is filled with steel wool, so again, be difficult for an ember to get in. So depending on your location, this might really be an important strategy. So in wrapping up here, there are the priorities adjust when you get buildings that are close to each other, and we're gonna talk about 30 feet as being that point of separation. So what that means is if I had a building here and I had a concern about the potential ignition of the neighboring building, if I had a window on that side, I might upgrade the window to a tempered glass window, which has 3 times the heat resistant properties as annealed glass, which is the one that breaks in shards as opposed to tempered, which breaks in little crumbles. And I wouldn't necessarily have to do it on all sides of the building. I'd only have to do it on where I think there's exposure potential between 2 buildings. So, you know, there's different ways to parse this out, and you don't have to do everything everywhere. You just have to think about where the exposure points will be. So I'm going to conclude by saying wildfire policy and action evolves. And if you look at like the seismic changes that happened in California, it took almost 40 years for us to really get on board with that. And so, you know, the wildfire paradigm is evolving in its own way. And, you know, part of it is, you know, shifting to reflect other vegetation types. Do you know that we lose more buildings in non-forested wildfires than we do in forest wildfires? We lose, you were talking about being from Southern California, and our shrub and sort of mixed vegetation types, we lose more homes and buildings in that environment than we do in forest fires, but we always, all of our, you know, it's always about Smoking Bear, and it's always about these log cabins, like those are the images we use to talk about wildfire and homes, and it's not appropriate necessarily. So what we're really trying to do is talk about shared vulnerability across all of California's ecosystem types and development patterns. But I'll just conclude by saying, I think there's really strong reason for hope. And now that we understand the mechanisms of loss in a much more predictable way, I think we can make very conscious choices, both in our new construction and our retrofitting. And so, you know, it's going to be a fun adventure to think about how we develop and improve California over the next couple of decades. So I'll conclude by thanking you for bearing with me on an evening, and I'm proud of you all for continuing to stay the course with evening talks, and pass these out and take any questions. Yeah.
Yes, in terms of like replanting after fire, I remember, you know, you said that when you first started, there were 6 or 7 nurseries, and there was a big fire and all the trees would replant trees. And I remember in Yellowstone, when Yellowstone burned, that was what, about 30 years ago, they decided not to do anything, and all the trees have grown back. A lot of trees have grown back there. But where I was in San Diego and Cuimaca, hiking there after the pine forests burned down, you know, they replanted parts of it. All the trees that I saw, most of them are dead. They planted are dead because of climate change. So, you know, it seems to me like a lot of these places that are burning are going to be replaced with savanna, kind of, you know, scrub and oak maybe. But I think they left on their own rather than the pine, you know, pine and fir forests. Okay, so the question is just is replanting still an option, or if there is replanting, do you consider the climate change when doing that, and how that's going to affect what can grow in the future of these areas?
So the question is really, I'm just gonna repeat it for these guys, is really about, what do you plan in the future in a post-fire environment and how do you think about those issues? And I think it's really, it's very site specific. And it's important to think in very site specific ways. I think there's lots of opportunity for reforestation and restoration. There's gotta be an eye towards really what is gonna be successful in that environment. I also do a lot of work in forest health, so from a North Coast viewpoint, I'm not a proponent of planting offsite conifers. Because you're not aware necessarily of the vulnerabilities of pathogen. We're in a pathogen dominated system, and so it's really easy to miss and help accelerate the expansion of certain pathogens by doing that. To me, it's really more about density management and really thinking about the more of the site carrying capacity to get towards a more healthy and resilient condition. But it takes investment and it takes labor and time and resources to be able to reestablish a stand. And so, I think you can't underestimate what that takes. And sometimes it takes a couple of different rounds of reforestation to be successful and some interventions along the way.
But is the program meant to just replace with what
No,
was burned?
not necessarily, not necessarily. I mean, I think as a land manager, being eye to what the conditions were. And often I'm looking at a landscape that really was sort of artificially created beforehand. And so trying to understand ecosystem processes is really important. I think it's important to look back, but I think it's also really important.
This is part of the post-fire management. I think one of the things that comes in there is what we read about is salvage logging, which naturally we read eco news, and so it's bad. So there's salvage logging sometimes really mean just taking some of the trees and
Completely.
so it's not taking all the trees.
Why would you take something of absolutely no value? I mean, economically, right? Why would you put the crews and the resources in? Doesn't make any sense. I think the labels are the problem, right? I'm gonna get me in trouble, but I'm a little tired of the term logging and really want to talk about forest management and really think about the tree removal process as one of the tools in the toolbox, but that's not the goal necessarily. The goal is really to figure out how to create resiliency in that landscape. And to do that, you might need some economic return to be able to afford to carry the longer ongoing maintenance costs, taxes, insurance, and all of those things. Salvage logging, and I'm not trying to give you some puff piece, but salvage logging to me is like you have a moment where there's a pulse of trees that are now dead, and there's a short time window where some of those have some economic value, not all of them. Why wouldn't you remove some of those trees to manage the fuels of the future, get some return so that you can do all the other stewardship things you need to do?
Provide shade, even though it's just the.
Sure, but you can't afford to take all of those trees out.
Fine, that's what I'm saying, is if you leave some of you actually give some shade and grow that. Basically.
Sure. I mean, I don't know if you're aware that, like, we've moved to a standard of using plastic culverts a lot of the time. And plastic culverts are slightly less expensive. They also don't they don't rust out, but they also burn in wildfire. And you often can't notice that they burn, right? So the investment in road and infrastructure damage, like we have lots and lots of buried wood in our roads. And like in the post-fire environment, oftentimes you have to rebuild the entire road prism because you've got lost and damaged that is burned in that environment. In Santa Cruz, they saw a lot of this. Caught that in fruit, but there are lots and lots of costs that we all want to see people take good action on because you want to steward the watersheds and you want to make sure that you're not concentrating water and getting into the creeks. But how do you afford to do that? Right? There aren't incentive dollar programs that people get to provide resources for folks to do that. So being able to realize some economic return to be able to take care of the stewardship activities for me is super important. Maybe that's cool.
Well, thinking about your home hardening and in your kind of contentious political environment. The ability to regulate and to say thou shalt, no matter what you say, somebody kind of be resistant to it, right, and change its heart. I'm just wondering your thoughts of like the ability to do this kind of thing through regulation versus, like, to me, it's almost like an insurance thing. Like, okay, you don't want to do this, well, then we're either not going to insure you, double the price because of the the cost and the threats you were having. Any thoughts on those?
Absolutely. So the question is really about where does the market come to play in stimulating action versus the regulatory approach? And does insurance have an intersection in this conversation? So I think it depends on what part of the equation you're talking about. In the defensible space world, we already have codes on the book that says that people must manage their fuels. We've had that since 1965. This is not new. It wasn't until 2006 that we expanded out to 100 feet. So nothing's really changing in that kind of framing of the equation. Well, enforcement's getting, well, we didn't even fund defensible space inspectors within a consistent way in California until in the last couple of budget cycles. So it's an entry level position. It's makes sense that we've had a hard time with it. In terms of building codes, we've always had building codes on the books. Now there are standards for a major remodel or new construction having to meet this new exterior performance standards called Chapter 7A. And that has come on the books since 2008. So if you're in a high or very high and very high firehouse severity zone, that's the standard. So we're catching new construction. So what do you do with the existing construction that is in some state? You have an old Victorian, you have a beautiful historic home. Like, what do we do about that? Well, the reality is that, so we're starting with a disclosure process now in real estate transactions. So there's at least informed consent around what you're buying. But the insurance industry, because they've experienced so many losses, is basically stepping up and driving this conversation now. So whether it's a good idea, because you want to do it for the right reasons, it may be that maybe the only reason, it may be that the insurance demand is what is going to stimulate the action.
In my case, for
Yeah. So we're, the world is changing very quickly. I think being an early adopter makes some sense, and I'm happy to help anyone think it through and talk about it and think about the choices and the opportunities.
Well, thank you.
Welcome.
Yana.